What would you do if your future MIL hired a private investigator to destroy your wedding? My mother-in-law Monique hated me from the moment Antoine brought me home. She critiqued everything. My job wasn't prestigious enough. My family wasn't connected enough. My apartment was too small. At our engagement party, she pulled Antoine aside 3 times to talk privately. She cried in the bathroom and told guests I was trapping her son. She called Antoine daily, asking if he was really sure about me. At family dinners, she'd bring up Antoine's ex-girlfriends. "Remember how successful Amelie was?" she'd say, staring at me. "Catherine came from such a good family." Antoine always defended me, but Monique never stopped. I was walking to my car after work when I noticed the same black sedan I'd seen 3 times that week. Same driver. I'd been a private investigator for 8 years before I quit. I knew surveillance when I saw one. I checked my old industry database that night. Monique had hired Jean-Pierre Tremblay 2 weeks ago. Her contract scope read, "Find disqualifying information on subject within the next 4 weeks." I realized Monique wanted dirt to expose me at my wedding, and decided if Monique wanted dirt, I'd give her dirt. The next morning, I staged my first scandal. I met my cousin Gabriel at a coffee shop with huge windows. Made sure we sat where anyone outside could see us. I touched his arm, laughed, leaned in close. The black sedan was across the street. 1 week later at dinner, Monique smiled at me. "Elise, do you ever catch up with old boyfriends?" I acted nervous. "Old boyfriends? Number. No, I don't." "Why?" "Oh, no reason." She really thought she was winning. She had no idea the bomb I was going to drop. Next, I created fake credit card statements showing $50,000 in debt. I printed them and left them in a folder on my passenger seat, parked where I knew the PI would photograph it. 3 days later, Monique pulled Antoine aside after dinner. "Are you sure about Elise? Are you absolutely sure you know everything about her?" Monique was planting seeds, getting more confident. All while inside, I was dying with excitement. My own investigation had concluded, and what I'd found on Monique was more shocking than I ever imagined. Armed with what I had, I decided to go all out and rented a hotel room downtown. I had Gabriel meet me there, made sure I walked through the main entrance in full view. We grabbed coffee and went to the hotel gym together. But from outside, the photos looked terrible. That night, I followed Monique. She met someone in a parking garage. I recorded everything from 2 floors up. The man showed her photos on his laptop, the PI. Monique handed him an envelope. "This is perfect, but I need one more thing." "What's that?" "Make it look like she has a criminal record." The PI hesitated. "Mrs. Beaumont, that's illegal. I could lose my license." "I don't care. I'll pay triple. My son cannot marry this woman." I got every word on video, crystal clear. 2 weeks before the wedding, Monique announced at family dinner, "Everyone needs to come to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. I have something very important to share about Elise." I gulped and made my face hands shake like I'd been caught. In reality, I couldn't wait. She still had no idea what was waiting for her. When the rehearsal dinner arrived, Monique had a projector and screen set up. All of Antoine's family filled the private room. Monique stood after dinner. "Before tomorrow's wedding, you need to see something." Then she set up the projector. First slide showed photos of me and Gabriel at the coffee shop. "Elise has been meeting with her ex-boyfriend." Gasps filled the room. Next slide showed my fake debt documents. Then photos of me entering the hotel. "She's having an affair." Antoine went pale. "Elise, what is this?" Final slide was a fake criminal record. "She also has an armed robbery record she never disclosed." The room erupted. Antoine's grandmother started crying. It was finally time. I stood up calmly. "Those are interesting photos, Monique." She looked triumphant. "I hired a private investigator. I had to protect my son." "I know you did. You hired Jean-Pierre Tremblay." "I know because I'm a licensed private investigator. I worked with him." Monique's face changed. "Everything you showed is fake. I planted it. I knew you tried to break us up." You're lying," Monique stammered. I opened my laptop. "This ex is my cousin Gabriel. The debt is photoshopped. The criminal record is fabricated." The room murmured. "But none of that matters. Because while you were investigating me, I was investigating you." Monique's face changed. "I tracked everywhere you went. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years. You told your husband you were visiting your sister. I pulled up photos on the projector. This is where you actually went." Photos of Monique entering a house in Sherbrooke. Monique with a man. Monique with 2 teenage boys. Her husband stood up slowly. "Monique, what is this?" I walked to the door and opened it. A man walked in, with 2 teenage boys. "Everyone, this is Robert, Monique's other husband, and these are her other sons. She's been living a double life for 16 years. I stared at Monique. "I think you have some explaining to do." What she said next made me realize I'd only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. Monique grabbed the edge of the table and looked straight at Gerard across the room. She said Gerard knew everything about Robert and the boys from the beginning, that he helped pay for the second house in Sherbrooke for 16 years as some kind of private family deal. The room went dead quiet. Everyone turned to stare at Gerard. He sat frozen in his chair like someone had hit pause on him. My stomach dropped. The triumph I felt 2 minutes ago drained away completely. I thought I was exposing Monique's secret life, but apparently Gerard was part of it the whole time. This was way more complicated than I expected. Antoine stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. His face looked pale and his hands were shaking. He said the wedding was postponed until everyone knew the full truth about what had been happening. His voice shook, but he sounded firm about it. He looked at me with this expression I couldn't figure out. Not angry exactly, but not supportive either. Then he walked out of the private dining room without saying anything else. I heard his footsteps going down the hallway, and then the outside door closing. My phone was in my hand before I even thought about it. I pulled up the parking garage video and turned the volume all the way up. My hands felt steady, even though everything inside me was spinning. Monique's voice filled the whole room from the phone speaker. You could hear her perfectly asking Jean-Pierre to make it look like I had a criminal record. Several people gasped. Antoine's aunt put her hand over her mouth. Monique's face went completely white. The audio kept playing with her saying she didn't care if it was illegal and she'd pay triple. When it finished, nobody said anything for a few seconds. Robert stepped forward from where he'd been standing with his two sons near the door. He spoke in this calm, quiet voice that somehow made everyone stop and listen. He said yes, he and Monique had been together for 16 years. He said the boys were absolutely real, and they were his sons. Then he said he never knew about her first family until 2 weeks ago when I contacted him. The way he talked made everything feel more real. This wasn't just the big dramatic reveal I'd planned. These were actual people with actual lives I'd just blown up. The boys stood next to their dad looking scared and confused. The older one was maybe 15, and the younger one looked about 13. They both had Monique's dark hair. The room erupted after that. Carrie started crying, and some of Antoine's aunts rushed over to comfort her. Younger cousins started arguing with each other about who knew what. Someone's uncle was yelling questions at Gerard, but Gerard just sat there not moving or talking. Monique tried to explain herself to 3 different people at once. Her voice kept getting higher and more desperate. She moved from person to person, trying to make them understand, but nobody wanted to listen. I stood there watching it all happen, and felt completely disconnected from it. Within 30 minutes, everyone started leaving. People grabbed their coats and purses. Some left in groups talking in urgent whispers. Others walked out alone looking shell-shocked. Gerard finally stood up and left without looking at anyone. Monique followed him calling his name, but he didn't turn around. Robert took his sons and headed for the exit. The rehearsal dinner ended in total chaos with no answers and no plan and no resolution to anything. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while after everyone left. My phone buzzed with a text from Antoine. He said he needed 1 night of space to process everything. He was going to stay with a friend. I stared at the message trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to call him and explain everything. Part of me felt angry that he was treating me like I did something wrong when I was just defending myself. I started the car and drove back to my apartment alone. The streets were empty and quiet. Every red light felt like it lasted forever. The adrenaline that had carried me through the whole evening crashed hard. By the time I pulled into my building's parking garage, I felt completely exhausted. I turned off the engine and just sat there. 20 minutes passed. I watched people walking their dogs and coming home from wherever they'd been. Normal people doing normal things while my life fell apart. I kept replaying the moment when Monique said Gerard knew everything. That changed the whole story. I thought I was exposing her betrayal, but maybe I was exposing their betrayal together. Finally, I went inside and up to my apartment. I made coffee even though it was late because I knew I wouldn't sleep anyway. I opened my laptop and started writing down everything that happened at the rehearsal dinner. I forced myself to be detailed and specific. Who said what? Who reacted how? The exact words Monique used when she claimed Gerard was involved. I wrote for hours, filling page after page with notes. My hands were cramping, but I kept going. I needed to get it all down while the details were still fresh. I wrote about how Antoine looked when he walked out, how Robert's sons seemed terrified, how Gerard sat frozen while everyone yelled. I made myself be honest about my own actions, too. The fake evidence I created, the dramatic way I revealed everything, whether I went too far. I was exhausted and emotionally drained, but I kept typing until I had everything documented. The next morning, I called Gabriel. My voice was rough from not sleeping. I told him everything about how Monique turned the tables by saying Gerard knew about Robert all along. Gabriel was quiet for a minute, processing it. Then he said we needed to stay completely off social media. No posting about any of this. No discussing it with people outside the immediate family. I agreed, even though part of me wanted to tell everyone my side of the story. We talked about how tempting it would be to share the whole dramatic thing online. It was like something from a movie. But we both knew that would make everything worse, especially for Robert's sons. Those kids didn't ask for any of this. After I hung up with Gabriel, I spread out all the fake evidence I'd created over the past weeks. The photoshopped credit card statements showing $50,000 in debt. The staged photos of me and Gabriel at the coffee shop. The pictures of me entering the hotel. The fabricated criminal record. I put all of that in one pile. Then I made a separate pile of the real documentation. The parking garage video of Monique asking Jean-Pierre to frame me. The payment records showing money changing hands. Screenshots of the PI contract Monique signed. I needed to be totally clear about what was staged versus what was genuine proof of actual wrongdoing. If I mixed them up, I'd undermine the real case against Monique hiring Jean-Pierre to fabricate evidence. I labeled everything carefully and saved it in organized folders on my computer. Then I looked up the licensing board for private investigators in Quebec. I found their website and called the main number. A woman answered, and I explained I wanted to file a complaint about unethical conduct by a licensed investigator. She was professional and didn't ask for details over the phone. She said she'd email me the formal complaint forms and explained the basic process. There would be a review period, then potentially a hearing. She said cases like this usually took several weeks to resolve. Having a concrete procedure to follow made me feel better. I had something specific and real to focus on instead of just replaying the disaster of the rehearsal dinner over and over. I thanked her and hung up. The forms arrived in my email 10 minutes later. I started filling them out right away, attaching all my documentation of Jean-Pierre agreeing to fabricate a criminal record against me. I hit send on the complaint form and closed my laptop. My phone buzzed around 7 that evening. Antoine's name lit up the screen. The message was short. He was sending texts to all the wedding guests saying the ceremony was postponed. I stared at those words for a long time. Postponed. Not canceled, but not happening either. I started typing a response asking if we could talk. Deleted it. Typed something about understanding his decision. Deleted that too. Tried a third message saying I was sorry for how everything happened. Deleted it, and just sent back that I understood. 2 words. That was all I could manage. I put the phone face down on my kitchen counter and made myself eat something even though I had no appetite. The next morning I woke up early and called Gabriel. We needed to figure out who might leak this story to reporters or post about it online. He came over with coffee and we sat at my kitchen table making lists. Antoine's cousin worked for a local newspaper. We put her name at the top of the high-risk list. His uncle was always posting family drama on social media. Another high-risk name. We went through every family member who was at that rehearsal dinner, marked each one as either trustworthy, questionable, or definite risk. By the time we finished, we had identified 8 people who needed to be handled carefully. Gabriel suggested we reach out to the trustworthy ones first and ask them directly to keep things private. I agreed, and we drafted a simple message explaining that Robert's teenage sons were involved and deserved privacy. We sent it to 6 family members we felt confident about. Then I spent that afternoon doing something harder. I opened a blank document on my laptop and forced myself to write out everything I'd done over the past month. The staged photos with Gabriel at the coffee shop, the fake credit card statements, the hotel room setup, the fabricated criminal record. I wrote down exactly why I did each thing. Next to each action, I wrote whether my motive was justice or revenge. Some were clearly about protecting myself from Monique's attempt to destroy me. Those felt justified. Others were about humiliating her in front of everyone. Those felt different when I looked at them honestly. I drew a line down the middle of the page. Justice on one side, revenge on the other. More items ended up in the revenge column than I wanted to admit. The public revelation at the rehearsal dinner with Robert and his sons walking in. That crossed the line. I could have handled it privately. Given Monique a chance to come clean to her family herself. Instead, I orchestrated maximum embarrassment. I saved the document and closed it, feeling uncomfortable with what I'd written, but also clearer about my own actions. My phone buzzed that evening. Monique's name appeared. The text was long. She claimed I entrapped her. Said her lawyer told her she had grounds to sue me for defamation and emotional distress. I read it once, then again, a third time. Part of me felt irritated. She hired someone to fabricate criminal charges against me. She tried to destroy my reputation and my relationship, but another part of me recognized she had a point about some of my tactics. The staged evidence was entrapment in a way. The public humiliation went beyond what was necessary. Her actions were worse, but mine weren't entirely clean either. I didn't respond to her text. The next morning, I looked up Robert's number in my phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. I asked if his sons were okay, if they were dealing with media attention or family members bothering them. His voice sounded grateful. He said the boys were staying home from the school for a few days. They needed time to process everything that happened. I told him I was genuinely concerned about them. They didn't ask to be brought into this situation. He thanked me for calling and we kept talking. The conversation stretched past an hour. Robert explained how Monique's financial support worked. She sent regular transfers every month, always on the same dates. The amounts varied, but they came like clockwork. She maintained a schedule with remarkable consistency. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she'd drive to Sherbrooke, stay overnight, then drive back the next morning. For 16 years, she kept this routine without missing more than a handful of visits. The more Robert described the logistics, the more I realized this wasn't some casual affair. This was a fully parallel life. 2 complete households, 2 sets of children, separate routines and responsibilities in each place. It required serious planning and resources to maintain. Robert mentioned something that made me sit up straighter. Many of the transfers to his household account didn't come from personal bank accounts. They came from what looked like business accounts. He pulled up his banking records while we talked and read off some of the notation codes. Grant disbursement, community support, charitable contribution. The codes looked official, professional, not like personal money moving between family members. I grabbed a pen and started writing everything down. Account numbers, transfer dates, amounts, notation codes. The pattern Robert described made me uneasy. If Monique was using business funds instead of personal money, this went beyond just her personal choices. This might involve actual corporate misconduct. After we hung up, I spent that afternoon pulling up corporate filings for Gerard's company. I still had access to some investigative databases from my PI days. I searched for the company's annual reports and financial statements, found their community grant program listed in the charitable giving section. Then I cross-checked the dates and amounts against what Robert had given me. The pattern was unmistakable. Regular disbursements labeled as community support grants matched exactly with the transfers Robert received. Same dates, same amounts down to the penny. Gerard's company was funding Monique's second household through corporate accounts disguised as charitable giving. My phone rang the next morning while I was making coffee. Jean-Pierre's name appeared on the screen. I answered, and his voice sounded panicked. He was terrified of losing his investigator's license over what Monique asked him to do. The licensing board complaint I filed was serious. He knew it. He offered to cooperate fully with any investigation, said he'd provide documentation of everything Monique requested. I recognized this as an opportunity. Having Jean-Pierre's direct testimony would strengthen the case significantly. I asked if he'd be willing to have our conversation recorded. He agreed immediately. I pulled up a recording app on my phone and hit record. Jean-Pierre detailed exactly what Monique asked him to do. She wanted dirt on me. Anything that would make Antoine call off the wedding. When the regular surveillance didn't turn up real problems, she pushed for more. She specifically requested that he fabricate a criminal record, make it look like I had an armed robbery conviction. She offered to pay triple his normal rate for that service. He admitted he agreed initially because the money was good, but he got scared when he realized how illegal it was. He never actually created the fake record. That's why Monique ended up using the one I planted for her instead. Having his first-hand account on record felt like solid validation. Everything I revealed at the rehearsal dinner was true. Monique really did try to frame me. Jean-Pierre's testimony proved it beyond any doubt. Antoine knocked on my apartment door around 8 that evening. I opened it and saw his face looked tired and confused. He walked in without saying much and sat down on my couch. I sat across from him in the chair by the window. He stared at his hands for a minute before looking up at me. He asked if staging all that fake evidence was really necessary. I told him I knew Monique hired someone to destroy me and I needed proof of what she'd do. He nodded slowly, but said it felt like I went too far with the hotel photos and the fake criminal record. I defended myself by explaining I had to make it believable enough that she'd take the bait. He asked why I couldn't just expose her surveillance without all the elaborate setup. I admitted I wanted her to feel what it was like to be trapped and humiliated. The words came out harsher than I meant them. He looked at me differently then, like he was seeing someone he didn't fully recognize. I backtracked and said I wasn't entirely comfortable with everything I did either. The fake debt statements felt excessive when I thought about it now. The hotel setup with Gabriel probably crossed a line. He agreed the situation got completely out of hand on all sides. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The apartment felt too quiet and too small. Antoine finally said we couldn't make any decisions about the wedding until we knew the full truth about his family. I felt my chest tighten, but I agreed. He said his mother had been lying for 16 years and his father apparently helped fund it. He needed to understand what that meant before he could think about our future. I told him I understood even though part of me wanted to argue. He suggested we postpone the wedding indefinitely, instead of trying to force a resolution. The word indefinitely hung in the air between us. I asked if that meant we were breaking up. He said he didn't know what it meant yet. He just knew he couldn't walk down an aisle and make promises when his entire family foundation had crumbled. I nodded and felt tears starting but held them back. He reached over and squeezed my hand once before standing up. He said he'd handle canceling the venue and notifying the guests. I offered to help, but he said he needed to do it himself. He left around 9:30, and I sat in that chair by the window for another hour without moving. The next morning, Antoine texted me that Monique called a family meeting at her house for that afternoon. He said she explicitly didn't invite me. I stared at the message and felt anger rising in my throat. He followed up saying she was trying to control the narrative by getting to everyone first. I typed back asking what he thought she'd say. He responded that she'd probably spin everything to make herself look like a victim of my manipulation. I wrote that I couldn't stop her from talking to her own family, even if I didn't trust what she'd tell them. He sent back a thumbs up and said he'd fill me in later. I put my phone down and paced around my apartment for 20 minutes. The frustration of being excluded felt like being shut out of my own story. But I recognized she had every right to talk to her family without me there. I just wished I could trust her to be honest instead of spinning more lies. My phone rang around 7 that evening. Carrie's name appeared on the screen. I answered, and she said she wanted to hear my side of the story directly. She explained that Monique spent 2 hours at the family meeting painting me as a manipulative liar who staged everything. She said some relatives believed Monique completely while others weren't sure what to think. Carrie said she needed to hear from me before forming her own opinion. I appreciated her asking instead of just accepting family gossip. I spent the next hour walking her through everything that happened. I told her about finding out Monique hired Jean-Pierre. I explained how I staged the fake evidence to catch her in the act. I admitted the parts I wasn't proud of, like the hotel photos that looked worse than they were. I played her the parking garage recording over the phone. She listened to Monique asking Jean-Pierre to fabricate a criminal record. Carrie went quiet for a long moment after the audio finished. She finally said she believed Monique hired the investigator. She said the recording was pretty clear evidence of that, but she needed time to process everything else about the double life and Gerard's involvement. I told her I understood and thanked her for listening with an open mind. She said she'd stay in touch and ended the call. I woke up the next morning and decided to file the formal ethics complaint. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Private Investigator Licensing Board website. I downloaded the complaint form and started filling it out. I attached the parking garage video file. I included screenshots of Jean-Pierre's text messages. I added the payment records showing Monique's transfers to him. I wrote a detailed statement explaining how he agreed to fabricate a criminal record for triple his normal rate. Putting everything in writing felt constructive instead of just reactive. I was doing something official through proper channels instead of more dramatic reveals. I reviewed the complaint 3 times before submitting it through the online portal. The confirmation screen appeared saying my complaint had been received. I saved the confirmation number and closed my laptop. The licensing board sent an email that same afternoon. The message confirmed they received my complaint and assigned it case number LB 2024-1847. An ethics officer named Demetria Barton would review the case. The email included her direct phone number and said she'd contact me within 5 business days. Having a name attached to the investigation made it feel more real. There was actual structure and accountability happening now instead of just family chaos. I forwarded the email to my personal folder and felt some of my tension ease. The system was working like it should. There would be a proper review with rules and procedures. I sat back in my chair and took the first deep breath I'd managed in days. 2 days later, an envelope arrived from Gerard's lawyer. I opened it and found a formal letter on expensive letterhead. The letter offered a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a substantial financial settlement. The specific amount made my eyes widen. They wanted me to agree never to discuss any family matters publicly. The money would solve my immediate financial concerns completely. I could pay off my car, I could put a down payment on a better apartment, but something about the offer felt wrong in my gut. They were trying to buy my silence instead of addressing what actually happened. The letter made it sound like I was the problem that needed to be managed. I read it 3 times and felt more uncomfortable each time. This wasn't about making things right. This was about making the problem disappear. I called my own lawyer the next morning. I explained the NDA offer and said I wanted to decline it. My lawyer asked if I was sure given the financial amount involved. I said I was sure. Instead, I wanted to propose we engage a neutral third-party mediator. My lawyer asked what I hoped to accomplish with mediation. I told her I wanted to focus on finding truth and appropriate accountability. I didn't want to just make the problem disappear for money. She said she'd draft a counter-proposal and send it to Gerard's legal team. I thanked her and hung up. Sending the response through my lawyer kept things professional. It showed I was serious about doing this the right way instead of taking shortcuts. The lawyers went back and forth for about a week. Eventually, both sides agreed on a mediator named Rachel Reardon. My lawyer sent me Rachel's credentials and they looked solid. She had 20 years of experience in family mediation. She specialized in complex multi-party disputes. Rachel sent an email to everyone involved with ground rules for the first session. Everyone had to attend in good faith. No recording devices allowed. Everything discussed would be confidential unless all parties agreed otherwise. She scheduled the initial session for the following week at her office downtown. Having professional structure for these conversations felt so much better than the chaos of the rehearsal dinner. There would be rules and a neutral person keeping things on track. I felt cautiously hopeful we could work through this properly, instead of through more dramatic confrontations. I spent the time before the mediation session organizing all my documentation. I created a clear timeline of everything that happened starting from when I first noticed the surveillance. I marked the dates I staged each piece of fake evidence. I noted when Monique met with Jean-Pierre in the parking garage. I included the date of the rehearsal dinner and what was revealed there. I focused especially on protecting Robert's sons from unnecessary exposure. I made sure no photos of the boys were included in any documents. I kept their names out of the written timeline. I organized everything to prioritize harm reduction for the kids while still holding the adults accountable. The boys didn't choose any of this. They were just teenagers caught in their parents' mess. I printed 3 copies of the timeline and put them in folders. I added tabs marking key sections. I wanted everything clear and professional when we sat down with Rachel. This mediation was our chance to handle things right after weeks of chaos. The mediation session happened the following Tuesday at Rachel's downtown office. I arrived 15 minutes early with my folder of documentation. Antoine showed up next, looking tired. He nodded at me but didn't come over to talk. Monique walked in with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as her lawyer. Robert came alone, carrying a briefcase. Gerard arrived last, his face blank and unreadable. Rachel welcomed everyone to a conference room with a long table. She sat at the head and gestured for us to take seats on either side. I ended up between Antoine and Robert. Monique sat across from me with her lawyer beside her. Gerard took the chair at the far end. Rachel started by reviewing the ground rules. Everything discussed would stay confidential unless we all agreed otherwise. Everyone needed to speak respectfully. She would keep us focused on facts and solutions. Then she asked Monique to respond to the allegations that had come out at the rehearsal dinner. Monique's lawyer spoke first, saying that while his client acknowledged having a relationship with Robert, it did not constitute legal bigamy, since they never formally registered a marriage with the government. The technical distinction made me want to roll my eyes. Monique sat there looking composed while her lawyer talked about religious ceremonies versus legal documents. I kept my mouth shut and let Rachel handle it. Rachel asked if that was accurate, that there was no legal marriage. Monique confirmed it in a quiet voice. Rachel made a note and asked what documentation existed about the relationship. That's when I spoke up. I opened my folder and pulled out printed screenshots. I explained I had payment records showing Monique paying Jean-Pierre over several weeks. I also had the parking garage audio recording. Rachel asked if I could play it. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the small speaker Rachel provided. Monique's voice filled the room asking Jean-Pierre to fabricate a criminal record against me. Her offer to pay triple. The PI's hesitation about losing his license. When the audio ended, nobody said anything for a moment. Monique's lawyer was writing notes, but he didn't dispute what we just heard. I felt steady and measured watching the truth come out properly this time. Rachel asked Monique directly if the recording was accurate. Monique looked at the table and said yes. Antoine shifted in his chair beside me. Then he asked his mother a direct question. He wanted to know if she really intended to frame me with false criminal charges. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the hurt underneath. Monique didn't answer right away. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. When she finally spoke, she talked about how anxious she'd been about me not being from the right social class. She said she panicked when she couldn't find anything actually wrong with me. She kept talking about her fears and worries instead of just answering whether she meant to destroy my life with lies. I watched Antoine's face as his mother avoided taking real responsibility. Something was breaking between them that I didn't think would ever fully heal. His jaw was tight and his hands were flat on the table. Rachel redirected the conversation and asked Robert if he had documentation about his relationship with Monique. Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He explained that he and Monique had a religious marriage ceremony 16 years ago at a small church in Sherbrooke. He passed copies of photos and a certificate to Rachel, but he clarified carefully that they never registered it legally with the government. Looking at the photos of Monique in a simple white dress standing next to Robert made my stomach twist. The deception had been so elaborate and intentional. Part of me felt relief it wasn't technically bigamy. Another part of me felt angry that the distinction even mattered when she'd been living a complete double life. Rachel reviewed the documents and made more notes. Then she asked about the financial arrangements. Gerard spoke up for the first time. His voice was flat as he explained that he'd known about Robert and the boys for years. He'd helped fund the second household through his company's community grant program. Antoine went completely still beside me. I could feel the tension radiating off him. He asked his father to repeat what he'd just said. Gerard explained that the grants were legitimate charitable disbursements that happened to go to Robert's address. Antoine stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He looked at both his parents like he didn't recognize them. Then he walked out of the conference room without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I sat there realizing his trust in both parents had just collapsed entirely. The mediation session continued for another hour, but the energy had shifted. Rachel tried to keep everyone focused on practical next steps. Monique agreed to provide full financial disclosure. Gerard said he'd cooperate with any review of the grant program. Robert asked about formalizing custody arrangements for his sons. I mostly listened and took notes. When the session finally ended, everyone dispersed quickly. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes. My phone buzzed with a text from Antoine. He said he needed time to focus on supporting his half-brothers through this crisis, rather than dealing with our relationship. His message was kind but clear about his priorities. I read it 3 times. Then I texted back that I understood and respected his choice. I meant it even though accepting we might not get back together hurt more than I wanted to admit. I drove home and spent the evening thinking about what to do next. The corporate fraud angle bothered me. Gerard using company funds for personal purposes looked like actual misconduct beyond just family drama. I had Robert's documentation about the transfers. I had dates and amounts. The next morning, I looked up the fraud division contact information. I called and asked to speak with someone about potential misuse of corporate funds. They transferred me to Detective Shane Gray. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. I provided the basics about the double household and the community grant disbursements that matched Robert's support payments. Detective Gray asked me to come in and bring whatever documentation I had. I met him 2 days later at the police station downtown. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with a direct way of speaking that I appreciated. I laid out all the papers Robert had given me. Detective Gray reviewed everything carefully. Then he explained the legal thresholds for proving corporate fraud versus legitimate charitable disbursements. He said these cases were really difficult to prosecute. Intent mattered a lot. Just because money went to someone Gerard knew didn't automatically make it fraud if the grants were otherwise legitimate. He asked what outcome I was hoping for. I thought about it before answering. I told him I wanted appropriate accountability, but I wasn't interested in destroying Gerard's company or creating a public scandal that would hurt innocent employees and Robert's sons. I said I cared about truth and safety, not vengeance. Detective Gray nodded like that made sense to him. He said he'd open a preliminary inquiry and interview Gerard about the grant program, but he was realistic about how it might go. I left feeling sober about the whole thing. Not everything wrong is necessarily criminal. Sometimes there's just messy behavior that doesn't quite cross legal lines. A few days later, Jean-Pierre called me. He sounded nervous and said he wanted to cooperate fully. He offered to sign a formal statement about everything Monique had asked him to do. I met him at a coffee shop near his office. He brought printed copies of payment receipts showing exactly how much Monique had paid him and when. He also drafted an affidavit detailing her request to fabricate criminal records and her offer to triple his normal rate. I read through everything carefully. His cooperation was going to strengthen the ethics case significantly. I felt careful optimism that the licensing board would take appropriate action, now that we had his first-hand account in writing. Jean-Pierre signed the affidavit in front of me, and I witnessed his signature. He looked relieved to have it done. I thanked him for doing the right thing, even though it was late. He said he couldn't sleep knowing he'd almost destroyed someone's life for money. I took the signed documents home and added them to my file. Everything was documented now. The truth was on record in multiple places with multiple people. Whatever happened next, at least the facts were clear and preserved. 3 weeks later, the PI licensing board sent an official letter setting the hearing date for Jean-Pierre's case and assigning Demetria Barton as the ethics officer. I called the number on the letterhead that same afternoon, and Demetria picked up on the second ring. She had a calm voice that immediately put me at ease. She explained that the hearing would focus on Jean-Pierre's agreement to fabricate evidence and his acceptance of payment for illegal services. She walked me through what questions the board would ask me, and emphasized that I should stick to facts without getting emotional or making assumptions about motives. She said the board could impose sanctions ranging from formal warnings to license suspension or full revocation depending on the severity. I took notes on everything she said and felt more prepared knowing exactly what to expect. She told me to bring all my documentation organized chronologically and to practice stating the facts clearly without editorializing. The conversation lasted about 30 minutes, and by the end I felt ready to testify. 2 days after that call, a thick envelope arrived by registered mail from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from Monique's lawyer claiming I had defamed her by revealing private family matters at the rehearsal dinner. The letter demanded I issue a public retraction and apologize for damaging her reputation. It threatened a lawsuit for emotional distress and reputational harm if I didn't comply within 10 days. I read the whole thing twice, feeling annoyed but not particularly worried. I called my own lawyer that afternoon and read her the letter over the phone. She asked me to send her copies of all my documentation, including the parking garage recording, Jean-Pierre's signed affidavit, and the photos I'd shown at the dinner. I scanned everything and emailed it within an hour. My lawyer called back the next morning and confirmed that everything I'd said at the rehearsal dinner was true and supported by solid evidence. She explained that truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. She said Monique's lawyer was probably just trying to intimidate me into silence, but that we had no legal obligation to retract anything. She drafted a response letter declining the demand and citing the documentation we had. I felt relieved knowing the legal threat didn't actually hold up. That same week, Antoine texted me saying he was moving out of his apartment into a temporary place closer to where Robert lived with his sons. He said he wanted to be available to help his half-brothers through everything they were dealing with. His text ended with a line thanking me for keeping the boys' names and photos private throughout the whole process. Reading his gratitude made something twist in my chest, because it reminded me of why I'd fallen for him in the first place. He'd always been someone who protected people who needed protecting, but I also knew our relationship was probably ending and I had to accept that. I texted back saying I was glad he was there for his brothers and that I'd continue keeping their privacy protected. The next afternoon, Robert called and said his teenage sons wanted to meet me for coffee if I was willing. I agreed immediately, and we set a time for the following day at a quiet cafe near their school. When I arrived, both boys were already sitting at a corner table looking nervous. The older one was maybe 16 with dark hair like Monique. The younger one looked about 14 with Robert's features. I sat down and ordered coffee while they both stared at their hands. I started by telling them directly that I would continue keeping their names and photos out of any public discussion, no matter what happened with the legal proceedings. I promised them I understood they didn't ask for any of this, and that my goal was protecting them from unnecessary exposure. The older boy looked up at me and said they'd been living in fear for 2 weeks that their entire lives would be destroyed by media attention. He said they were terrified reporters would show up at their school, or that classmates would find out and spread everything on social media. The younger brother added that they didn't choose any of this situation and just wanted to finish high school without everyone knowing their family's business. His voice cracked a little when he said it, and I felt protective in a way I hadn't expected. I told them I would do everything possible to keep their story private, and that I'd already turned down media inquiries. They both seemed to relax slightly after that. We talked for another 20 minutes about practical things like how to handle questions from friends if anything did leak. I gave them my phone number and told them to call me directly if they felt unsafe or pressured by anyone. When we said goodbye, the older boy shook my hand formally, and the younger one just nodded, but I could see gratitude in both their faces. The following week, Detective Gray called me with an update. He said an anonymous accountant from Gerard's company had contacted him with information about the community grant program. The accountant had provided documentation showing how funds were routed to Robert's address for years, with notation codes that didn't match standard charitable disbursements. Detective Gray said the leak suggested there were people inside the company who knew something was wrong, but hadn't reported it until now. I felt uneasy hearing that because it meant the deception might have involved more people than just Monique and Gerard. The accountant's information indicated a pattern of deliberate misuse rather than isolated mistakes. Detective Gray said he was opening a preliminary inquiry into the corporate fund transfers and planned to interview Gerard about the grant program's administration. The investigation was moving forward officially now, which validated my concerns, but also made me nervous about how far the consequences might spread. I thanked him for keeping me informed and hung up feeling sober about the whole situation. 2 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door around 7 in the evening. I looked through the peephole and saw Monique standing in the hallway alone. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. She looked different from I'd ever seen her, with no makeup and her hair pulled back messily. She asked if she could come in for just 5 minutes. I hesitated but finally stepped aside and let her enter. Monique sat on the edge of my couch and immediately started begging me to help spare her sons from public exposure. She said she was terrified of losing her social status and reputation in the community. Her voice shook when she talked about how the scandal could destroy her family's name. I watched her carefully and saw real fear in her eyes, rather than the manipulative confidence she usually projected. For a moment, I felt something like empathy for her alongside my anger, but I also knew I couldn't let that sympathy make me compromise on what was right. I told her clearly that I wouldn't participate in any more lies or cover-ups no matter what pressure she applied. I explained that my goal was restitution and protection for the kids rather than destroying everyone involved. I said if she wanted my help protecting her sons, she needed to take real accountability for her actions instead of just trying to manage the damage. I set a firm boundary that I would support outcomes focused on making things right, but I wouldn't help her avoid consequences she'd earned through her own choices. Monique nodded slowly like she was processing what I said. She asked what accountability would look like, and I told her it meant being honest with everyone about what she'd done and why. She sat quietly for a minute and then stood up to leave. At the door, she turned back and said she would think about what I'd said. After she left, I felt drained but also clear about where I stood. The next morning, Rachel emailed everyone involved to schedule a second mediation session. Her message said this session would focus specifically on outcomes and restitution, rather than rehashing what had already happened. The agenda she attached emphasized practical solutions for moving forward, including financial restitution, custody arrangements, and privacy protections for Robert's sons. I read through the whole agenda twice and felt grateful for the clear structure. Having specific goals for the session made it feel manageable rather than overwhelming. I marked the date on my calendar and started preparing notes about what outcomes I thought would be fair and realistic for everyone involved. The second mediation session was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, which gave me 3 days to get my thoughts organized. I spent Tuesday evening going through everything one more time, making sure I had clear ideas about what needed to happen next. Wednesday morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. Antoine's name showed on the screen. I answered and heard him take a deep breath before speaking. He asked if I thought people could forgive each other after everything that happened in a situation like this. His voice sounded tired but calm. I sat down at my kitchen table and told him honestly that I thought forgiveness was possible, but it took time and real work from everyone involved. We talked for almost an hour about what that might look like. He brought up the wedding without me having to say anything first. We both agreed we needed to cancel it officially, instead of leaving it in this weird postponed state. Neither of us was angry when we talked about it. He said he still cared about me, but couldn't imagine getting married right now with everything so broken in his family. I agreed completely. We decided we should return the engagement rings to each other and stay in touch as friends if that felt right later. The conversation felt sad but also mature and honest. After we hung up, I sat at my table for a while just processing what had happened. Our relationship was really ending. Not with fighting or blame, just with both of us acknowledging that too much had changed. 2 weeks later, I got an email from Demetria at the licensing board saying Jean-Pierre's ethics hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. She asked if I wanted to attend in person or submit my evidence in writing. I decided to attend so I could see the process through completely. The hearing took place in a small conference room at the licensing board offices downtown. Jean-Pierre sat at one table with his lawyer. I sat at another table by myself. 3 board members sat at the front reviewing documents. Demetria presented all the evidence I had submitted, including the parking garage video where Monique asked Jean-Pierre to fabricate a criminal record. She also had Jean-Pierre's signed statement admitting what he agreed to do. The board members asked Jean-Pierre questions about his decision-making and why he went along with Monique's request. He answered honestly that he needed the money and convinced himself it wasn't that serious. One board member asked if he understood that creating false criminal records could destroy someone's entire life. Jean-Pierre said yes, and that he regretted it completely. After about 90 minutes, the board went into a private room to discuss. They came back 20 minutes later with their decision. They placed Jean-Pierre on probation for 2 years with mandatory ethics retraining. He could keep his license but would be monitored closely. If he violated ethics rules again, his license would be revoked permanently. I felt relieved hearing the decision. There were real consequences for what he did, but his whole career wasn't destroyed. It seemed fair given that he cooperated and showed actual remorse. That same week, Detective Gray called to update me on the investigation into Gerard's use of company funds. He explained that the prosecutor reviewed everything and decided not to file criminal charges. Instead, they were recommending what he called a diversion program. Monique and Gerard would have to enter into a formal agreement to pay back the money that went to Robert's household. They would also receive an official warning that went into a database. If either of them got into legal trouble again, this warning would be considered. Detective Gray said this approach focused on making things right instead of just punishing people. He asked what I thought about the recommendation. I told him I supported it completely. The whole point was accountability, not destroying everyone's lives. He seemed pleased with my response and said he would move forward with setting up the diversion agreement. I hung up feeling like the system was actually working the way it should, even if it was slower and less dramatic than I expected. The next day, Gerard's company issued a press release that showed up in my newsfeed. The statement announced that Gerard was stepping down temporarily from his leadership position, while an independent review examined the company's community grant program. The announcement said the company was implementing new transparency measures and oversight procedures. It didn't mention any specific problems or name anyone involved, just vague language about ensuring proper procedures going forward. Reading it gave me a strange sense of civic relief. The system was working. Slowly and quietly, but working. Changes were happening because people spoke up and followed through. It wasn't the dramatic public scandal Monique probably feared, but it was real accountability. A few days after that, Monique sent an email to the entire extended family. I was included in the distribution list. She had written a statement taking responsibility for deceiving everyone about Robert and the boys. She admitted she lied to both families for 16 years. She said she was starting therapy to understand why she made those choices. The statement announced she was separating from both Gerard and Robert, so she could focus on setting up honest relationships with both men as co-parents. She asked for patience from everyone while they all figured out what came next. The tone surprised me. It felt genuinely humble instead of just trying to manage the damage. She didn't make excuses or try to justify anything, just took responsibility and laid out her next steps. I read the email twice trying to find hidden manipulation, but it seemed sincere. The following Saturday, Antoine and I met in a coffee shop parking lot to return our engagement rings. He pulled up next to my car and we both got out. The weather was cold and gray. He handed me the small box with my ring inside. I gave him back his ring. We stood there for a minute, not really knowing what to say. Then we hugged. It lasted longer than I expected. I felt tears on my face and realized he was crying a little too. We pulled apart and he said he hoped I would be okay. I told him the same thing. We agreed to stay in touch but acknowledged our romantic relationship was over. Getting back in my car afterward felt heavy and sad. But there was also something dignified about how we handled it. We were ending things with respect instead of blame or bitterness. Monday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a familiar voice. Evander Pike, my old mentor from my PI days. He said he heard about what happened through industry connections. He told me he was impressed with how I handled the whole situation once everything came out. Evander explained he was now working for a corporate ethics firm that did internal investigations for companies. They needed someone to lead a new practice focused on ethical conduct and clear boundaries. He wanted to offer me the position. The salary he mentioned was significantly better than what I made before. I felt surprised and also validated. Someone recognized that I tried to do the right thing even though it cost me my relationship and caused a huge mess. Evander said the firm needed investigators who understood that ethics wasn't just about following rules, but about protecting people and making things right. I told him I needed a day to think about it, but I was definitely interested. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Quiet pride. Maybe I could actually use my investigative skills for good. I called Evander back the next day and accepted the job offer. We spent an hour on the phone discussing what building an internal investigations practice would look like. He wanted me to develop clear protocols for handling misconduct reports, create training programs for investigators, and establish standards for how cases should be handled. Starting this new role felt like finding real purpose after weeks of chaos and confusion. I was excited about channeling everything I learned into helping companies deal with problems the right way. Evander said I could start in 3 weeks, which gave me time to wrap up loose ends and find a new apartment closer to the office. A week later, Carrie called and invited me to her house for tea. She said she wanted to stay connected with me even though the wedding wasn't happening. I drove to her house on Thursday afternoon feeling nervous about seeing her. She welcomed me warmly and we sat in her living room with tea and cookies. We spent 2 hours talking about everything except the scandal. She asked about my new job and where I was thinking of moving. She told me about her garden and a trip she was planning. Her decision to keep a bridge open to me felt like warm proof that not every family relationship was destroyed. When I left, she hugged me and said I was always welcome to visit. Driving home, I felt grateful for her kindness. 3 weeks later, I started at the ethics firm. My office was small but had a window and felt professional. I spent the first week meeting people and learning about ongoing cases. Antoine texted me asking if he could stop by one afternoon. I said yes, and he showed up at my office that Friday. He looked around at my new space and said it suited me. We sat in my office and he thanked me for how I handled everything after the initial revelation at the rehearsal dinner. He said he appreciated that I focused on protecting his brothers instead of just trying to hurt his mother. We talked about staying in touch occasionally, but agreed we needed clear boundaries. He would text me updates about the family sometimes, and I would do the same about my life. But we wouldn't try to be close friends or pretend nothing happened. His ability to have this conversation so calmly showed me how much he had grown through everything. When he left, I felt bittersweet, but also peaceful. We had both changed, and we were both moving forward. I called Robert 2 days later and gave him contact information for 3 legal aid organizations that could help him set up proper custody arrangements for his sons. He sounded relieved when I explained how they could formalize child support agreements and parenting schedules now that everything was out in the open, and we spent almost an hour going through which services would work best for his situation. Robert thanked me multiple times for thinking about his boy's legal protections, saying he had been worried about how to handle everything correctly, but didn't know where to start. Helping him felt good in a way that surprised me, like I was finally using my investigative skills for something constructive, instead of just exposing problems. A week after that conversation, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment with Monique's return address written in careful handwriting. I stared at it for several minutes before opening it, half expecting another threat or manipulation. Inside was a 3-page handwritten letter on nice paper, and the first line said she was writing to apologize for hiring Jean-Pierre and trying to destroy my reputation before the wedding. The letter went on for pages, accepting full responsibility for what she did, explaining that she had been terrified of losing Antoine and had convinced herself that any method was acceptable if it protected her son. She wrote that she understood now how wrong that thinking was and how much damage she had caused to everyone involved, including her own family. What struck me most was that she didn't make excuses or try to justify her actions by blaming me or anyone else. The letter felt genuine in a way her previous communications never had, like she was actually being honest instead of trying to manage the situation. I read it 3 times that evening, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name. The anger I had carried for months felt less heavy somehow, though I still wasn't ready to respond or forgive. I put the letter in my desk drawer and decided not to answer it right away. Instead, I pulled out my journal and spent an hour writing about everything I was feeling, trying to process the complicated mix of anger and sadness, and maybe something like cautious hope. My therapist and I had been working on releasing resentment without needing the other person to fix everything, and this felt like a good chance to practice that. I wrote about how Monique's apology didn't erase what she did, but maybe showed she was capable of change. I wrote about how I didn't need her to make me whole again because I was already doing that work myself. Letting go of the anger felt like choosing inner peace over keeping score. And by the time I closed my journal, I realized I could move forward whether Monique changed or not. The extended family held a meeting the following week that I didn't attend, but Antoine filled me in on later. Everyone agreed to keep all the details private to protect Robert's sons from media attention and school gossip. The family also decided that the money Gerard had used from corporate accounts would be repurposed to cover therapy costs for everyone who needed it, and legal expenses for Robert's custody arrangements. Antoine said the practical resolution felt pragmatic and focused on harm reduction rather than punishment, which was exactly what I had hoped would happen when I first suggested mediation. Hearing that the family was prioritizing the boys' well-being over drama or revenge made me feel like maybe my approach had been right after all. I spent the next afternoon organizing all my evidence and documentation into clearly labeled folders. I made copies of everything important and stored the originals in a fireproof safe I bought specifically for this purpose. 3 reporters had contacted me over the past 2 weeks asking for interviews about what they called a fascinating family scandal. I declined all 3 inquiries with the same short message saying I had no comment on private family matters. Closing the case officially and choosing privacy over publicity felt like the final step in handling this situation with actual integrity. Part of me had been tempted to tell the whole story publicly, to make sure everyone knew what Monique had tried to do to me, but protecting Robert's sons mattered more than my ego. I started apartment hunting the next week, looking for a place in a neighborhood I had always loved but thought I couldn't afford. My new salary from the ethics firm made it possible now, and I felt excited about picking out a space that was completely mine. I found a 1-bedroom with big windows and hardwood floors in an area with good coffee shops and a park nearby. The landlord approved my application within 3 days, and I signed the lease feeling proud of myself for building this life on my own terms. Moving in took 2 weeks, and I furnished the apartment entirely based on what I actually liked, instead of what would impress Antoine's family. I bought a comfortable couch in blue instead of the beige Monique always said was more sophisticated. I hung art that made me happy instead of the tasteful prints she thought were appropriate. The fresh start in a space that reflected who I actually was felt like reclaiming my independence. Several months passed with me settling into my new job and new apartment. I had been working on a complicated internal investigation for a tech company when my phone buzzed with a text from Antoine. I opened it to find a photo of him at a hockey game sitting between his 2 half-brothers, all 3 of them grinning at the camera with foam fingers and team jerseys. His message said thank you for helping protect them through everything, and that he was grateful I had prioritized their safety over getting revenge on Monique. His gratitude came without any strings or expectations attached, just genuine appreciation for how I had handled things after the initial revelation. I felt warm detachment looking at the photo, happy that Antoine was building a real relationship with his brothers, but no longer wishing I was part of that family. Looking back on everything that happened, I could see now that exposing Monique's messy truth had ultimately led to more honest and safer lives for everyone involved. Robert's sons had legal protections they didn't have before. Antoine had brothers he never knew existed. Monique was in therapy working on her issues. Gerard was implementing better transparency at his company. I had found work I was genuinely passionate about, and relationships based on authenticity rather than deception. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the right thing to do creates chaos before it creates clarity, and that real accountability is complicated but worth pursuing even when it costs you something precious. And that's all for now. I always try to make these stories carry something real you can use, even if it's just a small reminder. If this one clicked for you, that's a win. Subscribe so you can catch the next one.